I wish you a productive and inspiring day ahead. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kardashian. And ladies and gentlemen, I couldn't be happier to sit here and hear the DDG reminding us of great ideas, by reminding us about the importance of the early years which precede the schooling careers of our children. This report is coming at a critical time, just after the release of the 555 report for 2024, which has shown that only 42% of the children who have had some exposure by attending an ECD program, only 42% of those are school ready. Only 42% of those attain their child outcomes. And so you can then think, if these children start grade R, and in grade R, then we have about 48% of children who are not school ready at all, who did not start strong. It really underscores the importance of the work that we have to do once our children get into grade R. Firstly, just by making up for all the deficits that they come into the schooling years already exhibiting. But we have other people who are going to perhaps dig a little bit deeper and form those connections for us. And the next person now who is going to tell us about what are their reading benchmarks and how were they developed, that we're saying are totally linked to the funds survey. And that person is none other than our own Dr. Uphumelele Nyati Mohoshwane, who is the Director for Reading at the Department of Basic Education in South Africa. Her work has included system monitoring and conducting research and evaluation of education interventions. She's part of the research team for the government-led early grade reading study, randomized controlled trials, which have been done over the last 10 years. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. Uphumelele Nyati Mohoshwane.
Okay, here we go. You should be able to hear me now. Let me start by saying thank you so much for honoring our invitation and being here, as already acknowledged by our chairperson, Ms. Manona, and DDG Padiaki. It's been a privilege and a pleasure to work with all of you until we've gotten here. I will be speaking about establishing the reading benchmarks, so explaining what the reading benchmarks are, why we've established them, and what they look like, before you hear about the results of the national survey. So as I've mentioned, I'll be speaking about why benchmarks, why they matter for the early grades in particular, why we have chosen to have language-specific benchmarks. Then I'll be speaking to the what, the methods that we've developed and the innovations that we have introduced, and then the how, specifying the actual benchmarks. South Africa has for a long time been interested in measuring learning outcomes and making that a priority in formal documentation. So we have our action plan, our sector plan that commits to goals of reading for grade 3 and grade 6. We've also seen in the medium strategic framework since 2019 a commitment to 10-year-olds reading for meaning, and you would have heard the current president, President Ramaphosa, also speaking in his State of the Nation address about a commitment to have 10-year-olds reading for meaning. So while these documents have all currently been updated, the focus on reading has been ongoing since the previous cycle. We have all heard this statistic. The top one is more familiar. This is a table that's showing you the performance of South Africa in the progress in reading literacy study, so the PIL study. It's the stat that says 81% of children cannot read for meaning or cannot reach the low international benchmark in the PIL study. We also have our own local assessment, so the South African systemic evaluations that were introduced and released, I think 2 years ago now. They also measured children in grade 3, and they found a similar stat. Only the children in the bottom bands there are reaching the expected benchmark. So similarly, about 60% of children were not reaching the grade appropriate benchmark in grade 3, according to our own national assessments in 2022. And so those measures are important, and South Africa should continue to participate and benchmark ourselves against the world and even measure nationally. But they are only showing us what we are calling the tip of the iceberg. Because of the stats that we are seeing, if we're hearing that 80% of children are not reaching the benchmark or 60% of children are not reaching the benchmark, it means that for our case, in the case of South Africa, understanding what's happening below the iceberg matters if the majority of the children in our system are below that iceberg. And so these kinds of assessments that I've spoken about so far, what I'm calling the tip of the iceberg, measure written comprehension. We believe that written comprehension is especially important. It is the ultimate skill we are all aiming for. It's when a child is able to sit on their own, read a text for themselves and draw meaning from it. But there's so many skills that lie beneath that iceberg, and this table shows you what those skills are. They start from oral language, they build onto fluency, they include vocabulary, and then ultimately get summarized into written comprehension. And so, as I've been saying, we want to get to that tip of the iceberg, but there are also these underlying building blocks that we need to make sure are in place. This is just the table that is saying what the assessment landscape looks like in South Africa. I've already spoken to PEARLS. We have the EGRA assessment that teachers and subject advisors use. We have the South African systemic evaluations. We believe and support the assessment for learning work that's been happening. We participate in SACMEC, which is a regional assessment. We have ELNA, and as mentioned, we also have Thrive by 5. But we have a gap where Funda Uphumelele is coming in. All these assessments are important and they measure different things for different reasons, but we do not yet have a measure of grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3, the foundation phase that lies between the systemic evaluations at grade 3 or ELNA and 5 by 5 at the start of schooling. And so this is the gap that Funda Uphumelele is filling. So why do we need benchmarks for foundational skills? We want to clarify key milestones in early reading development. We want to enable early identification of children at risk. We want to support timely and targeted remediation. We want to have teachers guide differentiated instruction, and we also want to measure progress towards system goals. And so we had the work of deciding which skills are going to be the ones that we use to do this. And we needed to choose skills that predict later written comprehension. So is there a relationship between the benchmarks and written comprehension? The answer is yes. We chose skills that predict written comprehension. We needed to pick skills that can be explicitly taught. So how are we going to empower teachers to reach these benchmarks? We want to pick something that they can actually teach explicitly, and something that is a constrained skill. So we have things like vocabulary. All of us are still expanding our vocabulary, and so that would be a difficult benchmark to attain. But something like letter sound is constrained. There are only so many letters in the alphabet, and so that's something that you can master as a teacher and as a learner. We also needed to use a metric that is easily understandable. So there are different reasons for using different metrics, but we wanted to choose one that's easy to communicate, and that would be relevant across linguistically diverse contexts and different socio-economic landscapes. And so with that in mind, we chose to benchmark fluency. You'll be hearing about the specifics of that shortly. I don't need to make the case in this room about the language diversity we have in South Africa. Even though we often refer to African languages as a group, they are in fact not one group. We further distinguish them into 4 families: the Nguni, Sotho Setswana, Tsonga, and Venda, which are single languages. They also are not in the same family. And this has implications for children's reading because of how languages are written and how they are spoken. And so benchmarks could not be borrowed from English and copy-pasted even to Afrikaans or to any of the African languages. And so we needed to do the careful work of benchmarking for each language respectively. Here's an example to make that point further. In this table, you are seeing a sentence, well, a few sentences in English at the top. Look at how those sentences are written in isiZulu, and look at how they are written in Sepedi. In isiZulu, that English sentence, which is 7 words, is 3 words. Saying the same meaning, but only 3 words because of how the isiZulu language is structured. If you look at Sepedi, there are many 2-letter words there that are saying the same. And so what reading success should be counted as when you are teaching an isiZulu learner would be different to the number you would need to attain for a Sepedi learner and an English learner, even though we are getting to the same meaning. So the benchmarks are distinguished because of the language structures that we have in South Africa, and we are still getting, though, to the same meaning for all children. And so with that in mind, we embarked on a reading benchmarks approach. We produced this report called the design report, and we considered 3 criteria. You can set benchmarks using criteria, you can set benchmarks using expert consultation, and you can set benchmarks using data. We chose to use the data-driven approach. However, we of course aligned this to CAPS, so we did align it to an actual criteria, and we worked with experts. I'm gonna introduce you to our first graph for the day. Get ready, Stephen has a whole bunch of those, so I'll start the work here. So what you are looking at here is a graph that is measuring accuracy and speed. Accuracy is for every attempt you get, how many do you get correct? So how accurate are you in reading, and speed is how fast you are reading. And so what you are seeing here, you can see a linear relationship there. So the faster you are, the more accurate you are. If you're looking at the bottom of the graph, the people who are close to 0 in terms of speed are also not accurate. They're getting every second word they are reading incorrect. But the more accurate you are, the faster you are. But if you look at the top, we have a 95% accuracy line there, dotted line. It shows you that there is a bit of a flattening once you get to 95% accuracy. So if you're reading 100 words and you get 95 of them correct, which is very good, you start reading a little bit slower. There's no further gain for pushing you to get to 99%. But if you are reading every second word incorrectly, you're also reading very slowly because you're trying to still make up your mind about what you're reading. And so we needed to think about that. What is a good threshold that we can adopt in order for children to make meaning? And we think that what is underlying this is that if you're reading really slowly, you are still trying to decode. It means you haven't mastered the decoding aspect. If you have mastered decoding, you can then focus all your attention on meaning making, but you then read faster and more accurately. We also don't believe in speed for the sake of speed, so we don't want children to just speed read for the sake of that. It's supposed to enable them to read, and so we also think there is an upper threshold above which reading faster than this doesn't help us. And we were able to relate this to comprehension. So based on those accuracy and speed numbers I've just shown you, this graph shows the relationship between fluency and comprehension. And here again we can see that the more fluent learners are, the more they comprehend, which is exactly what you want. So one part is measuring the fluency part, but that fluency needs to translate into actual comprehension. And so we were able to check that. And the last, I guess, graph from me is this one. We were fortunate to have early grade reading study data where we had tracked children from grade 1 through till grade 7. What you're seeing here is the performance of children in grade 7 who were on track in grade 3. So look at the very bottom one. Here you are seeing in green, this is the performance of children in grade 7 based on how they did in grade 3. So the children at the bottom in grade 7 who are all green had met the grade 3 benchmark when they were in grade 3, and now are meeting the grade 7 benchmark, or are doing well in grade 7 because they were on track in grade 3. So we were able here to validate our benchmarks that they do really contribute to long-term learning. So those early milestones, early goals, attaining them early is actually useful for the ultimate skill of reading comprehension. And so we have produced several reports on reading benchmarks. These are all on our website. They are across the languages. In the case of the Nguni languages, there's a combined report. In the case of Sesotho Setswana, we've got the same, but all the other languages have their own reports that are on our website. And then finally, second last slide, we have here the reading benchmarks across languages. The benchmark for letter sounds is the same across all languages. We can imagine in South Africa, even though our languages have complexities, when we're speaking about single letter sounds, we all are using the same letters. They get a little bit complicated with digraphs, trigraphs, syllables, etc. But at the very least, at the start, everyone has the same letters. And so we have set the benchmark for letter sound knowledge at 40 correct letters in a minute. And here again, making the point, reminding us, you could get to 60 letters correct in a minute, we've seen that. But because we were not chasing speed for the sake of speed, 40 is enough to be mastering letter benchmarks. Then we have oral reading fluency benchmarks for grade 2 as well as grade 3. And here you can see a very big difference between the languages, a different benchmark for isiZulu compared to Tsonga and other languages because of that distinction I mentioned. It's worth mentioning here that we have updated 2 benchmarks. We have updated the Afrikaans benchmark since publishing, and we have updated the Tsonga benchmark since publishing. So what you will see in the reports are all the benchmarks you've known and heard about until now, but there have been updates for Tsonga and Afrikaans, and we have finally benchmarked English. That should not say forthcoming. We have an English home language benchmark now, and you'll get an English benchmark report soon. But yeah, all the languages, all 11 languages are now benchmarked, and we have also benchmarked for English as a first additional language, considering how many children read in English as a first additional language. And then finally, this work was only possible because of a range of skills. We needed to work with experts in early grade reading. We needed to work with African language linguists. We have linguists in the room from all 11 languages, from more than 8 universities across the country. We chose to work with linguists where the language is dominant, so the people who have been working for the Xitsonga language would have come from Limpopo primarily, even though they may have been paired with someone who is from another university, so that we are capturing the authenticity of that language. We needed to work with data collectors. There was a lot of data collection, you can imagine, across all these languages. We worked with quantitative experts who were helping us to analyze this data, and we needed to work and think about the research and policy implications. So this is not the work of one person or a single set of skills. It's only been possible because we've been able to collaborate across the board. And thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much to Bomi for really sharing with us where it all began, what got us to where we are today. And thank you as well for acknowledging all the experts and the linguists, data collectors, researchers, you name it all. Can we give a round of applause? Shout out to all the experts who collaborated with the Department of Basic Education to make this a reality. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that report and that presentation was really very important, because it then gives us this anchor that we need to have in our minds as we are about to receive the report on the funds. But I think what Bomi has also showed us about the importance of data and evidence-driven programming and solutioning is critical. When she shared with us, as much as she didn't really dive deeper into that, but I think what she has shared and flagged is important for us to know that our commitment to data and evidence is actually, we are on the right track. When she showed the longitudinal tracking of children who have had that early intervention through the EGRS to really show that if you start early, it is then that you are going to see that dial moving. It's actually linked to what Mr. Parehachi was saying earlier on about the importance of early investing in the early years of children, including what we need to do now when we know that those who are starting in grade R need remediation. What kind of remediation is it that we need to do? So we have the data, we have the evidence. That heavy lifting really does pay off. Thank you so much. We are now going to move to our next speaker, and our next speaker is the speaker who is going to take us through, where are my papers? I have a lot of papers here. The next speaker is going to take us through, can you give me yours? I've misplaced mine. I need the bio of Dr. Brian Ramadiro. I had it just now. I think I've located it now. Okay. So, it's not in one of these. Hi, Brian. I can't do that injustice to you. Yes. All right. Thank you very much, Mpumi. Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is the speaker who's going to take us through the African language development features and contributions of the benchmarks. And that is Dr. Brian Ramadiro, who is a policy director of the Nelson Mandela Institute for Education and Rural Development at the University of Fort Hare. He works in both initial and in-service teacher education with a particular focus on language and literacy. His expertise lies in the design, implementation, and research of language and literacy interventions. He has published widely in the field of literacy education and holds a PhD in applied linguistics from the University of London. No missing paper could deprive me of that. So, Brian, thank you very much for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kulula. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Let me just start by saying the purpose of this presentation that I'm about to give to you is to invite you to hold us and to hold, well, is to hold each other accountable for the use of these benchmarks in the future. These benchmarks are useful, but they've got many limitations. So, yeah. So I want to kind of make sure that all of us, we feel accountable for using these benchmarks sensitively as well as critically. And remember, these are just artifacts, so they're just our best approximations of what we think is happening in the reading process. So they're not a fetish. So, and I don't think we should fetishize them in the future. So know that when there's distance now between when the benchmarks were established and their use in the future, they may kind of seem like they're these mutable things. I think they're not. They're just simply our best approximation of what we think is going on when children learn to read. But also I think we need to remember that these studies that we're doing, they're looking at linguistic features, but also the cognitive aspects of learning to read. And of course, in African languages, that work has just begun. In languages like English, there's been many studies that have been validated over time with tools and so on. So we're just starting to do that. And we need to understand how best So we need to understand how best to leverage specific linguistic features of these languages. For example, things like morphology, which Professor Magaleda has been imploring us to do. So we're trying to understand how we can leverage these things to best, to help children learn how to read. And remember, all these things at the moment are just our hypothesis. We know logically, for example, that by manipulating morphology, we could help children to pay attention to the words that they're reading. But that's just a logical analysis. So we've started now to collect data to see whether this logical analysis is supported by data. Okay. And I think as we hear tomorrow, we can see that there is some correlation between morphological awareness and word reading, for example. We find this in all of these African languages. But what we don't know, is remember, like as I said, these are just linguistic studies. So we've studied these features. These are cognitive studies. But what we don't know yet is, are these things teachable to young children? Can you teach young children how to manipulate these things? And even if you can teach them to young children, is the time that you're using to teach them, is that time well spent? Could you be teaching other things, for example, that also equally or maybe better help them to learn to read? We don't know that. So we still need to follow this up with pedagogical studies, classroom-based studies and so on. So I think I'm saying all of this actually just to say that we are at the very beginning of this process. again, I think also focus on benchmarks could also make us neglect the connection between home, community, and school, and how that impacts real development. Now, this is quite important, actually, I think, because I think, for example, when we look at children from middle-class homes and so on, a lot of the background support, but also a lot of the abilities. Well, let me put it certainly. I mean, it's very, very difficult to teach children to read in the context of school only. So children, their attitude, their motivation to want to read and so on has got a lot to do with what goes on in their homes. You know that, and this is true, especially for middle-class children. And I think without thinking through, and I know that many studies, especially for poor children, it's quite difficult to make that connection, that link between home and school. It's very, 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 very hard. But because it's hard, I don't think it means that we shouldn't try. We should keep on trying to create that link, because we know that by finding that connection, by making it, by enabling parents to support their children, we know that children in school will make much more progress in their reading. I think it is right. I think the main point here that I want to make is that, of course, the risk of these reading benchmarks is that it can narrow the curriculum. So teachers now can focus just on, like, okay, let's get fluency, or let's get better technical skills, and so on. And then, so that could have unintended consequences. Yeah, so the curriculum could be quite narrow and so on, but also it could mean that schools that are underperforming, they get extremely controlled. I think, as you know already, schools that perform very well in our country, they hardly. So the point I was making actually is that poor schools, they get over-monitored, over-regulated, and so on. And that also with schools that do very well, they have to get any visiting anyway. So they get much more autonomy and freedom to do what to do in their schools. So, and because now the schools that are underperforming, they are subject now to all this testing and so on. And then they are also then, as a result, subject to a lot of control and oversight and monitoring and all of that. Yes, and I think also, I think the other point is that by definition, these benchmarks, they move the focus away from the system of education to learners and their teachers. So they get monitored, and then they get to be held accountable for a lack of performance in schools. And that's yeah. So, and actually, I think that's a tension that we keep, that we need to keep on thinking about, because as a system in South Africa, we haven't reached a point where we can say every school has enough teachers that are properly trained and supported. They have enough materials for to teach reading. That I think until we get to that point, it's absolutely unreasonable to place like a major share of that accountability on teachers and learners, but not on the system. And I think the benchmarks actually they will shift. I think so. I think as I'm saying that we need to so when we use these benchmarks, we need to be quite careful that we not putting all the accountability just at the individual level of learners and teachers, but that we collectively still are holding ourselves accountable for making sure the teachers and learners have the resources that they need to make reading a success. That's good. Okay. But also there's some issues around methodology. I think the main point here that I want to make, I think I made it actually earlier on, which is that these are, at best, these benchmarks are our best approximation of what we think is happening. And remember that all of these things, like oral reading fluency, letter sound knowledge, and so on, all these things correlate ultimately with comprehension, but there's no strict direct causal relationship between good oral reading fluency and comprehension. But these things, they are associations, the relationships of association. So, and this reminds us actually also to be quite humble about, because there are teachers that we don't quite know what they are doing, but they're able to produce children that are able to read. So it's not by, and they're not counting like oral fluency and so on, but it's kind of about, yeah, it's got to do with heat in children, what else they use, the time they put in, and so on. So you can't ultimately reading, it's not made up of a number of discrete things. It's kind of how those things come together in a skilled teacher and how they manage to get children to develop these skills. Yes, and I think that also going forward, I think what we need to understand more than the actual benchmarks, but is actually need to understand more about how teachers get children to acquire all these discrete skills in different classrooms. I think the only point that I want to make on this slide, which I haven't made before, is that also what we're going to try to understand over time is that, remember, I think as Funda said, the benchmarks are developed on the basis of a standard language. But as we know, learners in our schools, they speak different varieties of African languages in different places. And the benchmarks are developed and are based on standard language on a standard variety of Xhosa, Zulu, and so on. So over time, also, we need to understand what is the impact of sub-varieties on reading outcomes, on how children do on these tests. We don't know that, so we still also need to learn about it. So I think for all those reasons, we should then approach, I think, these welcome the benchmarks, but also use them in a sensitive way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. I think that is very important what he's just shared with us. Firstly, you and Bumi have really refreshed their memories, for those of us perhaps who have not really worked with the benchmarks since their release, taking us down memory lane and really forming that link between the benchmarks and what we are about today. But I think what you have then gone on to do is to really remind us about how we need to manage tensions between things that hold potential and value, like the benchmarks, and what their limitations could be. And I think it's so important what you have just shared with us, that it's important for all the layers, from policymakers, program developers, right up until the teachers, to understand the blind spots that the critics are kind of asking us to pay attention to, without really taking the value away from the benchmarks that do hold value. At this point, I'm informed that the Minister is on her way, and I know that she really wants to sit through as much as she has had. A very brief snapshot into what we are going to be sharing today, and we're going to be socializing it widely beyond today. So we are going to get started because she has had an initial presentation delivered to her. But what I'm going to ask you, Stephen, is that when the Minister comes, we are just going to then just pause and allow her to take a seat, and we're going to greet her very warmly. And greeting her very warmly means me asking all of us to stand up and allow her to come, and Bumi will receive her at the door and will come and bring her to a seat, and then we will resume with the presentation. She wants to be part of this presentation so that when she responds then from a point of view of having really received it and her memory being refreshed. So, right now, I am going to ask the next presenter, who is going to do the double clicking now on the actual survey and what it means for us, including the results of it. And that is none other than Dr. Stephen Taylor, who is the Director for Research, Monitoring and Evaluation at South Africa's Department of Basic Education. Dr. Taylor has a PhD in the economics of education, and he has 16 years of experience in educational research in South Africa and the region. Prior to joining the DBE in 2011, he contributed to the education chapter of the National Development Plan and consulted for organizations like the Human Sciences Research Council, the Ministry of Education in Botswana, and the World Bank. So, ladies and gentlemen, I now give you Dr. Stephen Taylor. Thank you so much. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone.
Exactly as I had predicted. Here it comes. Ladies and gentlemen, let's just rise to welcome the Minister of Basic Education. Morning. I represent when I'm asked to. Thank you very much. You're welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, the Minister of Basic Education, Minister Siviwe Kwafube, has just joined us. Thank you very much, Minister, for making the time. Dr. Stephen Taylor is just about to give us the report on the Funda Uphumelele National Survey results. And over to you, Stephen.
So we just need to figure out a way to move the slides forward because it's too far. All right, thanks again, everyone, and I have a privilege of sharing some of the results, which, to borrow from a familiar metaphor of the reading benchmarks, is a bit like the tip of the iceberg. The data analysis and the report writing, it really is the tip of the iceberg. As Mpumi mentioned, there's a lot of work that went into this process, from all the linguists working on the passage development and then the test development, to all the piloting in three sets of pilots, each in 55 schools, the data collection, the fieldwork teams. These were really big efforts that went together to finally produce a really high quality data set that I had the privilege of helping analyze. And And it will be a resource not just for this report and the analysis that's already been done, but it will be a resource for researchers going forward to really understand reading development in all our languages much better into the future. So this is really just a highlights package of some of the analysis that's possible using this Funda Uphumelele data set that we now have. Right, so in the presentation, I'm going to focus on a few things. The sample design firstly, so we better understand where we've collected data from. Then I'll be sharing the main results, which the sort of main headline finding is the percentages of children across the grades and across the provinces and languages who are reaching these benchmarks, which we've just heard about. That took a few years to define. I'll then focus in on a few more categories of reading fluency, not just reaching the benchmark or not reaching the benchmark, but assessing it into a few more categories. I'll speak a little bit about reading comprehension because we also measured that in the survey. I'll then speak about some of the relationships across reading domains, so understanding how the different skills relate to each other. And there'll be a little bit of a focus on an interesting aspect, which is comparing learners who are assessed in their home language with learners not assessed in their home language. Right, so on to the sample design. So the idea here was we wanted to have a nationally representative sample, but also we wanted to be able to have a sample that was large enough within every province and within every language to be able to say something with enough statistical precision about each language and about each province. And so we came up with this design which kind of factored in where children are in the country based on their language and province combinations. So what you can see here is that this shows the number of schools in each of the province language combinations that we ended up sampling. So in blank cells, the white cells, that's where we didn't sample anyone. And the reason was there were just not enough children speaking that language in that province. So for example, Sepedi in Eastern Cape is just so infrequently spoken that if there weren't hardly any schools, in many cases there would be 0 schools where children were learning through that language in the foundation phase. What this meant was we wanted to have at least 59 schools in each province and at least 59 schools in each language group. That inevitably meant that certain provinces, in particular Mpumalanga and Limpopo, would have very large samples because there are certain languages that are almost only spoken in those provinces. Like Chivenda is essentially almost only spoken in Limpopo. So we had to sample all the Chivenda children in Limpopo. But at the same time, Chitsonga and Sepedi are also predominantly spoken in Limpopo. So Limpopo has sort of a larger than necessary sample, but it was necessary because we wanted to have enough children in every language group. So that's kind of how the sample was designed. We also left out independent schools and also children in special needs schools. So the target population was public ordinary schools. We also made a few small exclusions, like some very small schools where there were less than 12 enrollments per grade, we excluded. And after making these exclusions, that ended up excluding 3.8% of the population, which is an acceptable sort of amount to exclude from the target population. All right, so it's a bit small. Some of these might even be small for me to see now. But just a bit about the realized sample. So the idea was we went to 710 schools nationally. We sampled 10 children per grade in grades 1, 2, 3, and 4. But I have to say that the caveat is we went at the start of this year. So we actually sampled children in the following year. So when I refer to grade 1s, what I'm actually talking about was these were children who were at the very start of grade 2. But the idea of benchmarks is they are targets that should be met by the end of grades 1, 2, and 3. So we sampling children at the very start of the following year as a measure of where they were by the end of their previous year. So we sampled 10 children per grade across 4 grades, grades 1 to 4. And that's the sample size. The total sample of children then is 27,838, I think. roughly equally spread across the 4 grades. Slightly more boys than girls in the sample. You can see about just over 1,000 more boys than girls in the end. And this is not because we somehow randomly sampled more boys than we should have. This is because there are more boys in the foundation phase than girls. Right? And if that surprises you, it is interesting. This is the start. This is the start of an interesting focus on gender, and there's a whole presentation lined up today about the gender differences, because the reason for there being more boys in the foundation phase than girls is because of higher grade repetition rates. Because boys spend more time in the foundation phase, therefore at any given point in time there are more boys than girls. So grade repetition leads to a kind of inflation of enrollments. Something important to bear in mind for many reasons. For example, comparing grade 1 enrollments to grade 12 classes years later. Enrollments are always inflated because of repetition, and therefore there's always more boys because of more grade repetition. Another result of the grade repetition fact is that when you look at the age profile of learners across the 4 grades by gender, as the graph on the right shows, this shows the percentage of children, and now I'm too far to point, anyway. I think, there we go, it's still working. So the age profile of boys and girls, what you can see is that boys, there's always a greater percentage of boys who are old for their grade than girls. Even in grade 1, there's 29% of boys that are old for their grade, but this age profile increases, the percentage who are old for their grade increases as you have more time to repeat grades along the way. But you can see already significant differences in the age profiles of boys and girls, also because of grade repetition. Next slide. Great. So then if we look at the realized sample by province, this shows the number of learners by province and and by grade. Fairly similar across the provinces. Obviously, Mpumalanga and Limpopo have large samples of children because they have to represent several. You might be worried that in the Northern Cape we have a similar number of learners to KZN, for example, even though the Northern Cape has a much, much smaller learner population. We correct for this, as is normal procedure when doing sample surveys using what's called sampling weights. And so when we look at the actual percentage of the population represented by the different provinces, you can see here there are more, this is more in line with population dynamics. So the Northern Cape represents 2.7% of the learner population, whereas KZN represents 21% of the learner population. And so when we present any national or overall statistics, we weigh them according to the population that they represent. So that is taken care of in the sampling design. If we look at it by language, we see, again, similar numbers of children in the sample by language, but again, once we apply sampling weights, we see that the languages account for very different proportions of the population. Interestingly, the largest group of children are learning through English as their lot in the foundation phase. So the way the sample was designed was because we wanted to assess children. 30% of South African children use English in the foundation phase. Although only 1 in 3 of those learners, their own home language is English. This is an interesting feature, especially in places like Gauteng. You have a lot of English in the foundation phase, despite it not always being the child's home language. Especially in more urban, more middle-class contexts, you have that happening. Whereas in your more rural contexts, children are more likely to be learning through home language in the foundation phase. Right, then if we look at the socioeconomic profile of the sample, what this shows is the percentage of learners that are in no-fee schools, which are poverty quintile 1 to 3 schools. You see that it looks very different across the language groups. Notable is that children assessed in English, only 18% of them are in no-fee schools. So this is really important to bear in mind, that this is a much more affluent group than, for instance, Chivenda children, 100% of them were in no-fee schools. So there's massive differences in the socioeconomic profiles across our language groups, similarly across provinces. Whereas in the Eastern Cape, you can see 94% of children in the sample were in no-fee schools. In The Western Cape, only 45% of children were in no-fee schools, and in Gauteng, 28% of children were in no-fee schools. And this you have to keep in mind, because we're going to have comparisons across provinces, comparisons across language groups of children. You have to bear in mind that a massive amount of those differences is driven by socioeconomic context. Really important, and partly why we want to discourage kind of league tables and comparing naive comparisons across languages as if it's a competition between Chivenda. All right, socioeconomic context is going to be really important to keep in mind. Similarly, at the province level, differences can really not be largely attributed to, say, the quality of provincial administration. I know we have some provincial representatives here who might want to take credit, but obviously socioeconomic differences across provinces drive a lot of what we see, not only the quality of the provincial administration. So on to the main results. This is probably the sort of the main results slide, where we see for each grade the percentage of children reaching benchmarks. For home language on the left and for English as a first additional language on the right. So we have, in grade 1, we have 31% of children nationally reaching the benchmark, which is 40 letter sounds per minute. So in grade 1, as Mpumi described, the metric for benchmarks, or the skill that we use to benchmark, is letter sound recognition. In grade 2 and grade 3, these benchmarks are set against oral reading fluency, which is words read correctly in a minute in a connected passage text. And there, as Mpumi described, the benchmarks are different across the language groups given their different orthographic features. But a similar percentage of children in grade 2 and 3 nationally also are reaching their benchmarks. So just over 30% of children in grades 1 to 3 are reaching the benchmarks. The grade 4 cohort was measured against the grade 3 benchmark. So that's why there are significantly more children reaching benchmarks in grade 4. It's not necessarily that things have improved dramatically in grade 4 compared to grade 3. It's just that these children are a year older, they've had another year of schooling to learn, and therefore a larger proportion of them are reaching the grade 3 benchmark for home language. For EFL, it's similar. It's sort of in the mid to high 30s for grade 3 and 4. We only measured this for grade 3 and 4. And the benchmark here, if I remember correctly, for grade 3, it's 50 words correct per minute for EFL, and for grade 4, 70 words correct per minute. It's important to also note that the EFL benchmarks, although slightly more children reach them than, say, in grade 3 at least, than the home language benchmark, this does not mean that children read better in English than in home language. The EFL benchmarks are set as an additional language benchmark, so they're set not at a home language level. So if you compare the English home language benchmarks, the English first additional benchmarks, the EFL benchmarks are a bit lower than what they are for English as a home language. So don't misinterpret that as children are better in English than home language. That's not quite the case. Next slide. So then we start disaggregating the main results by language, province, etc. Right? So this shows it by language for each of the grades. And a few things are worth noting here. Overall, the English language group had the largest proportion reaching benchmarks. As I've already shown, this is largely socioeconomically driven. Then probably, and this is actually not arranged in order, but it just happens to be the case that Afrikaans and Tshivenda are actually probably the next best languages that are similar across the grades. In some grades, Tshivenda children are actually more likely to reach benchmarks than Afrikaans. I would say Tshivenda is the one of the African language groups that's possibly performing slightly higher than one might expect given socioeconomic context, which is interesting. There are also some interesting dynamics if you look at the progress across grades within languages. So, for example, Xhosa, you see 37% reaching the grade 1 benchmark. So quite high relative to other languages when it comes to acquiring letter sound knowledge in grade 1. But then there's a decline in grade 3 in East Xhosa. So they're not really building on this initial letter sound knowledge that they have in grade 1. Whereas the opposite happens for isiZulu, even though it's also in the Nguni language group, it has the same benchmark and has very, very similar features to Xhosa. You see they do quite poorly in grade 1, very poorly in grade 1 at letter sound knowledge, but then improve in grade 2 and 3 and 4 in the percentages reaching oral reading fluency benchmarks. So there are some interesting dynamics across languages, points at which they dip and then start improving. If we go to the next slide, I think it shows it by province. Also some interesting dynamics across the provinces. So for instance, Gauteng starts relatively weakly, but it actually improves quite a bit by grade 4. And I wonder if this is partly due to the very multilingual context of Gauteng, where many children are actually learning through English and assessed in English, but it's not their home language. And so maybe there's sort of like, takes a bit of time, and by the time they're in grade 4, they've been learning English for a while, they're doing a bit better. Whereas in some of the other provinces, they start a bit better, but don't progress as well. So there are some interesting differences across provinces. I mean, in general, it's Gauteng and Western Cape that do the best, but as I've mentioned again, this is largely socioeconomically driven. Next slide, please. And to illustrate the socioeconomic influence, what this shows is performance by poverty quintile of school for each of the grades. And for each grade, you see a very familiar pattern, which is familiar to people like me who've analyzed the influence of socioeconomic status on educational outcomes for a long time. We see very little differences between quintile 1, 2, and 3 schools. They're all no-fee schools, very similar context. A slight increase for quintile 4 schools, and then a big increase for quintile 5 schools in the percentages reaching benchmarks. And you see that for grades 1, 2, 3, and 4. So socioeconomic status really has a big impact on the results. Next, we break down oral reading fluency into 6 categories. In this case, in grade 1, it's just 5 categories. So we have the green sections of each bar show the percentage who meet the benchmark. But then, for those not meeting benchmarks, we further decompose performance into 4 categories. At the very left, we have 0 scores. So these are children who, in this case for grade 1, could not identify any letters by the end of grade 1. And they actually assessed at the start of grade 2. And in some cases, it really is still quite large, like Siswati at about 20% of children not yet identifying a single letter sound. And then we have a group called non-readers, which is they can identify a few letter sounds, but it's still like so few that it's not really enough to be considered a reader. And then we have pre-readers and emerging readers who are at other cutoffs just below the benchmark. Go to the next slide, we see a similar decomposition by language for grade 2. And now there are 6 categories because for those who do meet benchmarks, we further identify amongst them a group who exceeds the benchmark. And this is defined as reaching the next grade's benchmark. So you can see there are some children who are reaching even the following grade's benchmark. But you see a lot of non-readers, so still quite a lot of children who by the end of grade 2 are not reading a single letter or are reading so few letters, so this is words now, so few words that they can't really be starting to read with meaning yet. If we go to grade 3, we'll see that the percentage of non-readers and 0 readers is starting to go down, but it's still quite high. And grade 4, and the next one we see goes down even further, but it still is alarming that quite large percentages in some languages of children are still not reading a single word by the end of grade 4. Next, we focus on comprehension, which is what we say is the all-important outcome of in-reading. At the end of the day, we want children to read with adequate meaning and understanding of what they're engaging with, and these preliminary skills all build towards reading with comprehension. And we have 3 different ways of measuring comprehension in the FIMES assessment. Firstly, we have what we call home language ORF, or home language oral reading fluency. What happened here was that each child in the test was given 2 passages to read, and after reading the passage, they were given 3 minutes to read the passage, and then we asked a few comprehension questions based on that passage. And what's nice about this is one of the passages was also administered in the previous grade, so we can compare children in adjacent grades on exactly the same passage and exactly the same comprehension questions, which allows you to see how much progress there is from one year to the next. We did a similar way of measuring English as a first additional language, where we only did this for grade 3 and 4. In grade 3, we administered 1 English passage. In grade 4, we administered 2 English passages with comprehension questions following that up. And then the third measure of comprehension we have is a written comprehension test in home language. And we did this at grade 3 and 4 only. And this is the Pearl style of assessment, where you have a story that's written and a few questions about the story. So written comprehension is a really important final outcome. Let's see just a few of the comprehension results. This shows the average comprehension scores on the home language off in the grade-specific passage that they took by language. And the results look similar to the percentage reaching benchmarks, which is important because reaching a benchmark is a type of predictor of comprehension. So you similarly see the English groups generally have the highest comprehension measures. What you see also is a progression across the grades. So in grade 1, as you might expect, only 15%, the average comprehension score is 15%. Essentially for grade 1, that is a very advanced skill. The benchmark is actually letter sound recognition. But nonetheless, we did administer a comprehension test, but it's really more like by grade 3 and grade 4 where you are expecting to see children reading with adequate comprehension levels. Let's keep going. We looked to give you a sense of the comprehension tests. This shows the 11 items in one of the comprehension tests that was administered to both grade 1 and 2 children, so the exact same test administered to 2 adjacent grades. And in each item, what you can see is the red section is the percentage of children who did not have the question administered to them. So the way this worked is that children first read a passage in oral reading fluency, and we measured how many words they read correctly in a minute. And then depending on how far they got in the passage, a question was administered to them or not. And children were given 3 full minutes. So although we took a measure of words correct per minute at the 1 minute mark, they were given a full 3 minutes to read the passage, which is adequate, like ample time for the passage. But they also showed where they got to. We recorded how far they got in the passage. And if they didn't get beyond a point, then they weren't then asked comprehension questions about the part they never read. All right, so, which is kind of fair, because if you're reading so slowly that you don't get to that point, it makes sense that you also try to read with meaning then. But the fact that you see a lot of children not having question 1 administered even means that these were essentially non-readers, that they hadn't even read a few words. Often they were opted out of the reading fluency, because if you don't read your first 5, you can't read the first 5 words, then you move on with the assessment, rather than sitting for the full 3 minutes awkwardly. So in grade 1, obviously you have large percentages of children who are not at the word reading level and therefore are not yet reading with comprehension. For those who did answer the questions, you can see what percent got it wrong and 1% got each item right. The graph here also shows the categorization of questions into 4 categories. There's literal questions, there were questions requiring straightforward inference, there were comprehension questions requiring interpretation and integration, and there were questions requiring what we call examining and evaluating. In the report, we've analyzed those types of questions in a bit more detail. Let's go to the next slide to show you a similar thing for grade 2 and 3. What you'll see is, as you move to the slightly older learners now, the red sections get smaller as more and more children are becoming readers. They then are more likely to have questions administered to them because they were able to read that far in the passage. And the next one shows it for grade 3 and 4 on the same passage. So in grade 4, as you can see there, much smaller percentages of children who didn't have items administered to them. Let's keep going. So then this assesses a few things here. So in these graphs, so we've got 2 graphs. Firstly, one for all the Sesotho-Setswana languages and one for the Nguni languages combined. The reason for that is because on the x-axis here we have oral reading fluency, and you can't have an oral reading fluency metric for these 2 language groups on the same graph because They have very different benchmarks. The Guinea languages are conjunctive, so they have lots of long words with prefixes and suffixes included. The Sesotho-Setswana languages are more disjunctive, so you have many more words. And as a result, when trying to graph something like oral reading fluency, you have to treat these groups separately. But then what each line shows is each line is for for the different types of items. So for instance, the blue line in each graph pulls all the literal questions in the comprehension test. And what we're seeing here on the y-axis or the vertical axis is the predicted probability of getting an item right. So what we're trying to see is, based on your oral reading fluency, does it change your predicted probability of getting an item correct? And clearly it does. You see, for all the different item types, on both graphs, you see a strong increasing relationship between oral reading fluency and your probability of getting a comprehension item right. So what this shows is that if your oral reading fluency is extremely low, you're highly unlikely to be getting items correct, regardless of what type of question it is. But also what you see is it flattens out. All of these lines flatten out, interestingly, round about where the benchmark is set. So these vertical dashed lines are where the benchmarks are set. So in the Sesotho-Setswana language grouping, the benchmark is at 60 words per minute, I think for grade 3. And that happens to be roughly where this relationship between fluency and comprehension flattens out, which is comforting to know because this is the intuition behind the benchmarks. The idea is that initially, developing fluency is really important for reading with comprehension, but only up to a point. There becomes a point where we no longer want you to read faster and faster because you've developed enough fluency to now be able to devote a lot of your working memory and attention to reading with comprehension, to engaging what you're reading with. And to emphasize that point further, in these early phases where there's a very steep relationship, these are very low levels of reading fluency. So low that if we had to, if you're reading, say, in the Guinea languages, 5 to 10 words in a minute, it would be painful for me to illustrate to you how slow that is. We would actually take a minute and read 5 words. It would be very painfully slow. And the point there is that these benchmarks are not encouraging children to race. It's not about reading fast. It's about just being able to become fluent enough that you're not painstakingly putting letters together. You're actually becoming fluent enough that you're able to think about what you're reading, right? Because that's the whole point. The point is you want to engage with the meaning of what you're reading and not be devoting all of your conscious attention to decoding letter by letter. All right, so that's very well illustrated here. The other point about this graph is that you see that the literal questions are the easier ones, followed by the examine and evaluate, then the straightforward inference, and the ones requiring interpretation and integration were the hardest. So for any given level of reading fluency, the ones requiring interpretation and integration were the hardest items in general in the test. But I should also mention there's quite a lot of variety within these types of questions. So you have, even amongst literal questions, there are some quite difficult literal questions and some quite easy ones. Right, so there's a whole lot more in the technical report, analyzing item type and analyzing the comprehension tests in more detail. Let's keep going though. Just a quick highlight from the written comprehension assessment for home languages at grade 3 and grade 4. By language, again, you can see the English children assessed in English doing the best, similar average scores across the remainder of the learners. Maybe one other point to note is that the average scores in the written comprehension were very similar actually to the comprehension scores in the oral reading fluency and the individual one-on-one way of measuring this. So in oral reading fluency and most of these assessments, they're one-on-one assessments with children, whereas the written comprehension is a group-based assessment where all the children sit together in a group and they're administered a comprehension test. But the scores are quite similar, which I think is comforting in that it shows that both measures do they do a reliable job of representing children's comprehension scores. This shows the breakdown of the written comprehension test for grade 4s for each of the 18 questions. And now what you see is there's much smaller percentage of children offering no response. And this is because there was no sort of opt-out rule here, because this was a written test, so there was they could answer any question. It didn't matter how far they read, they could offer an answer. Some of the questions were multiple choice, so there could also be some guessing involved. So you have larger percentages of children at least offering an answer. And then you can again see what percentage of learners got it right or wrong. Obviously, as the test goes on, you do see increasing percentages of children not answering, and that's probably because of time where they're getting towards the end of the test and maybe they didn't read far enough. But they were given a full half an hour, so they were given ample time for the assessment. Next slide. Right, so now we start to look at some of the relationships across the skills. I've already started a little bit. We showed a graph earlier showing the relationship between oral reading fluency and comprehension. So another way to assess the relationship across different skill domains is to just do what's called correlations. So this shows correlation coefficients between all of these different items. A few things to highlight. So the first assessment that was administered was a rapid object naming assessment. It's not actually a reading test at all. Children are on the prompt in front of them, they're given a bunch of pictures of objects like a table, animal, and then they're asked to rapidly to name as much as they can, and the objects repeat themselves often. So it's a measure of phonological processing, which is quite predictive of learning to read. It's also something that's often used to identify learning difficulties. So we didn't include it as an outcome of reading. It was more included as a way to analyze the reading results that we do see. So we see relatively low correlations between object naming and other aspects of reading. We see high correlations between, say, the two oral reading fluency passages. So that's also comforting because it means that both passages are doing a similar job of representing children's reading fluency. We also see very high correlations between the different comprehension tests. Again, comforting that the different comprehension tests are measuring the same underlying construct. We also administered semantic awareness, which is sort of an aspect of morphological awareness. This was measured using by testing children's knowledge of synonyms and of antonyms, and the correlations between the semantic awareness of children and other aspects of fluency were a bit lower, and I think this represents that semantic awareness and morphological awareness is sort of a different skill that contributes separately to reading from the more decoding-oriented skills. So it's also important, but there are different types of skills that you bring towards reading. Next slide. So this shows the relationship between rapid object naming and letter sound recognition, so for grade 1 children here. And what you can see is there is a positive relationship, so that as children have better phonological processing, they also tend to do better in letter sound recognition. But there's also quite a bit of variation within each group. So quintile 1 is the 20% who did the worst in rapid object naming. You can see that some of them still do relatively well in letter sound recognition, indicating that even if they did have weak phonological processing, they may have been able to be taught their letter sounds. So I think this shows, for instance, the importance of early learning, early cognitive development, but also that it's not all said and done by the end of your ECD phase. There's still variation depending on how you're taught these foundational skills. The next slide shows the relationship between letter sound recognition and isolated word reading, and for all the languages involved here, there's a very, very strong relationship between your learning your letters and whether they can read words, as we would expect. The next slide shows the relationship between oral reading fluency and written comprehension in a different way. So what we do here is we take this is kind of like a path diagram. So for the grade 3s and 4s, we split them firstly into 3 groups here. a group of non-readers over here who are like 0 words or like very, very few words correct per minute in their oral reading fluency. Then there's a group not reaching benchmarks, but they're at the pre or emerging reader phase. And then the green group is the group who met the benchmarks. And then we see how did they do in written comprehension. And we categorized the written comprehension scores into 3 categories. The top category being scoring at least 50% in your written comprehension tests. And you can see that the majority, I think it's 66% of children who met their fluency benchmark are also scoring more than 50% for comprehension. On the other extreme, for children who are non-readers, 86% of them scored less than 25% in the reading comprehension. And only 2% of them scored 50% in comprehension. So what this path diagram shows is that if you're reaching a benchmark, you're very likely to do well in reading comprehension. If you're a non-reader, you're extremely unlikely to end up reading with comprehension. Next slide, please. This shows then brings in the relationship between 3 things: oral reading fluency, semantic awareness, and written comprehension. So on the left we have a graph which shows the 6 categories of fluency, starting with 0 score all the way to exceeds benchmark. And then there are 2 lines. One is for children who have very weak semantic knowledge, and the other is for children with strong semantic knowledge. And then we're plotting their written comprehension score here. And what you can see is that there is a gap between those with weak and strong semantic knowledge. So semantic knowledge does matter for reading with comprehension, but there is still, even for those with weak semantic knowledge, there is an increasing return to fluency. On the right-hand side, we flip it around and we have semantic knowledge on the x-axis, and we have the gap here is between those who are non-readers and those who meet their fluency benchmarks. And there's a massive gap, firstly. But secondly, isn't a big return to semantic knowledge if you are a non-reader. So if you're not reading fluently, even if you have 100% for your semantic knowledge, you're still only likely to get about 20% of the comprehension test. So I think if you put this all together, what it shows is that your decoding fluency and your semantic knowledge both matter for comprehension, but fluency is sort of more of a binding constraint. Like if you're not reading, if you can't identify words fluently, even if you do have very good semantic awareness and knowledge, you can't read essentially with comprehension. The other point to note is that in our sample, most children actually had quite good semantic awareness, even if they were not reading their words fluently. And I think this emphasizes the importance of home language as a resource for learning to read, because most children come to the classroom and they have good morphological and semantic awareness in their home language, so they can bring that as a resource to the classroom. And so now if they're taught the skills of reading in that language, they're going to be able to succeed. Right, next slide please. Home language and English are also very strongly correlated, again emphasizing the point that your home language is a resource not only within itself, but also to reading in a second language. That once you've learned these skills of decoding in the language that you understand, you're also then able to transfer those skills to another language. Next slide, please. So, interestingly, we also ask every child what their own home language is, irrespective of the classroom environment that they're in. And what we see is that for English children, only 33% of children assessed in English actually have English as their own home language. In the other groups, the vast majority of children were assessed in their own home language. If we flip this around in the next slide and we say, based on your home language, were you likely to be assessed in that language? We see it's the other way. 95% of children whose home language is English were also assessed in English. So if your home language is English, you're very unlikely to end up in a Tsonga-speaking school. But if your home language is, say, Sesotho, you're quite likely to end up often in an English language school. In the Free State, this also happens to a fair extent. Gauteng also, you see a lot of this. Next slide. By province, as I just said, Free State and Gauteng are the ones that stand out as having the lowest proportions of children assessed in their home language. And remember, assess in home language essentially is the lot of the school. All right, so next slide. Then if you look at it by quintile, you see the same thing. Quintile 5 schools, only 44% of children in quintile 5 schools were assessed in their home language. Whereas in quintile 1 to 3 schools, the majority of children end up being assessed in their home language. And again, this is the context. So a lot of quintile 1 to 3 schools are in deep rural areas. You know, in rural KZN, almost all children are isiZulu, and they're learning through isiZulu. In Eastern Cape, almost all the children are isiXhosa, and they're learning through isiXhosa. But in Gauteng, you've got quite a lot of quintile 5 schools, and you might have children's home language is isiZulu, but they're learning through English. That often happens in these more rural in these more urban contexts. Next slide shows the learner performance, and this also would surprise you if you don't have your wits about you and think about what's happening here. This shows the percentage of children reaching home language benchmarks based on whether they were assessed in their home language or not. And with the exception of English, for almost all languages, if you were not assessed in your home language, you actually were more likely to reach benchmarks. Now, the reason is socioeconomic. Those not assessed in their home language are more likely to be in quintile 5 schools, in Gauteng or the Western Cape, and that's why they're more likely to reach the benchmark. It's not because it's better to be assessed not in your home language. It is better to learn through your home language, that's clear, but there's such big differences in socioeconomic context that that it turns out that those not assessed in their home language do better, but it's because they're in quintile 5 schools, in Gauteng, etc. So there's a lot of language dynamics going on where you have to think very carefully about what other factors are actually driving this. Next slide, please. So this is the final slide. It's a little bit about kind of summarizing all of this, saying so what and what next. But most of the day today is about the what next and the so what. So my reflections here are going to be very brief. Firstly, I think Funda Uphumelele presents a picture that is, I think, largely consistent with what we see in PEARLS and the South African systemic evaluation. And that's, we know we have quite a large percentage of children who are not on track in terms of reading. In PEARLS and systemic evaluation, it shows us the outcome of reading and comprehension, but FUN shows us why that is the case. It shows us in grades 1, 2, and 3 on these foundational or precursor skills why children are not on track to read with comprehension. And I think there's also sort of a value in focusing on these earlier skills, because if we focus on them and we target teaching to these skills, we are more likely to change things like the PEARLS results by focusing on the things that build towards those results, rather than just looking at the outcome. And maybe in the future we see similar performance in PEARLS and systemic. So I would say that it is a consistent picture, even though it's measuring something quite different to what those assessments measure. They measure the outcome, we measure what happens along the way in order to get to that outcome. I would say funds also, it's both an investment in home languages as well as a demonstration of the importance of home language as a resource for learning to read. Also, as we improve the learning and teaching of home language, I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this will have lasting impacts. We showed a slide showing the predicted value of your early grade reading fluency on grade 7 outcomes. We've also done, through the early grade reading study for a number of years now, we've measured the impact of different programs. And what we've seen is that those programs that have the largest impact in foundation phase are also leading to lasting benefits by grade 7 and grade 9, where children are more likely to reach grade 9 without repeating along the way, and are still doing better in home language and English skills based on having had a good home language intervention in the foundation phase. And so in line with that, the final point is that we do have evidence in South Africa around how to improve reading. And so I think now is the time to scale up those evidence-based solutions on the back of this evidence we have about the outcomes. And maybe just to say there that, you know, if all we done was Funda Uphumelele, one could say, you know, yes, we can measure the results, but what are we doing about how to change things and what interventions actually will work? Actually, in terms of the work that we've done as DBE over the last 10 years or so, we focused on impact evaluation of different programs and interventions. So we started there, and now we've looked at a measure of reading outcomes as well. So I'll leave it there, but I look forward to the Minister's response and input, but also all of your responses, the panels, everyone that's going to reflect on this and talk about the what next. So we have, I think, 12 versions of thank you there. Let me just say, thank you very much, Baida.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for really doing that double-clicking I had asked you to do. Colleagues and ladies and gentlemen, this is just one segment of the results. We're still going to dig a little bit deeper and look at issues with a particular lens on gender and the education context, as well as, again, look at provinces and a brief analysis to really build on what Stephen has done here with us. But again, Stephen, I think the importance of you reminding us again about the socio-economic context, and it's something that we're seeing as a pattern that does not even begin here. It begins even in the early grades, where we see that up in the early years, where we see that even in the early years, which Mr. Padaji spoke to, this very same pattern of poor children receiving the poorest outcomes. And I think it really tells us that there's something that we need to do. And again, as well, when we receive the gender, it's a pattern that seems to really be sticking. But the results is the beginning of the story, Minister. It's not the full story. The full story, as you're saying, is what are we going to do about having these results. We know what we know now, then what next? And I think that is the narrative that we want to rewrite for our children. Now that brings me then to the Minister of Basic Education, Ms. Funda Uphumelele. Minister, I am going to hand over to you, but I've been asked here that I must do justice, and as you are getting up, that I must read a bit of a bio. Diam isn't here. Diam isn't here to do the kind of bios that she does. So because you hate it so much, I'm going to be very brief and say that as you're getting up, ladies and gentlemen, I am going to give you Minister Siviwe Kwahube, and I know that some people trip over the Minister Siviwe Kwahube, who is the Minister of Basic Education in South Africa. I am not going to torture you and read a bio. I'm just going to ask us that. Let's just stand up with Minister. That's the bio that you're getting. All right. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. May take your seats. Over to you, Minister, to give us a response.
Honestly, always feels like an obituary, so that's why I tell you sit there and you kind of smile, growing up on the dusty streets of Wamti, and now you're wondering how long is this going to take. But ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning, and thank you to our program director, who looks absolutely stunning today. I think we can agree. And it is a pleasure really to join colleagues not only from the Department of Basic Education, our partners in universities and foundations, linguists, teachers, and researchers who have been walking this journey with us. Today feels like a milestone for South African education, and I think foundational learning in particular. When we speak about schooling outcomes, we often focus at the end point, which is on the matric results, university access, or employment statistics. But what happens much earlier in that journey actually determines how far a child will go. And a critical phase in that journey is learning to read. Learning to read is but part of a broader process of literacy development, but it is a gateway skill that unlocks so many other opportunities to access knowledge and learning. I think it was really fascinating to listen to Dr. Taylor about some of the really interesting things that are coming out of the study that really confirms a lot of what we already know, but now the question becomes, what shall we do about it? The goal of reading is to engage meaningfully with all sorts of texts, whether it's academic or it's pleasure for everyday reading. The goal is to read with comprehension. But reading with comprehension is a tip of the iceberg. Only the tip of the iceberg that is visible, but the largest part of the iceberg is under the surface. What we see in assessments that continue to measure reading comprehension, such as PEARLS or the South African Systemic Evaluation, is just a visible part. Beneath that outcome of reading with comprehension lies a whole range of foundational skills, such as phonetic awareness, vocabulary knowledge, associating letters with sounds, building words, and as these skills become fluent, they work together to make comprehension possible. To better understand how these foundational skills develop, the Department of Basic Education has led a process to develop reading benchmarks in all 11 official languages in South Africa. And I think that is a massive, massive undertaking. Whenever I speak to my counterparts around the world about some of their reading challenges, you can realize that a lot of what they deal with is but a small part of what we have to do. Often there's 2, 3 spoken languages, maybe 1 official languages, but in South Africa we have 12 official languages. And to be able to truly understand the crisis of literacy in our country, we have had to go and dig deeper into what are our languages showing us. And what I really appreciate in particular about the study is that it does not problematize our languages, but it actually says these are actually a massive opportunity. These languages are a massive opportunity for our children, for us to be able to do so much better when it comes to literacy and the literacy crisis. And I think that's exciting, because often the criticism has been, are PEARLS and other assessments really taking into consideration the local context in South Africa? And now we've developed a tool over years that says we're not only just looking at the local context, but we're looking at the relationship between language and comprehension. We're looking at the relationship between socioeconomic status and the ability to read for meaning. And all of these things give us a fuller picture. And I think we ought to be proud that as South Africans, we are not afraid to, one, do the deep kind of assessments that we need, whatever the results are, face them and use them to influence how we better make better decisions and policy work. And I think for me that's important. I think in South Africa we have come at a point where we no longer can afford to make decisions, but only on sloganism. That we have to be evidence-led when we are making policy decisions, particularly in a department as this one. And so, given the distinct linguistic features of South African languages, these benchmarks were developed separately for each group of the languages. The department spent about 6 years developing these benchmarks, language by language. And that for me is, as I said, one of the key things that we take out of the study. And now for the first time, Funda Uphumelele National Survey provides a baseline to measure the percentage of children in all languages who are reaching these critical benchmarks at the end of grade 1, 2, and 3. And so for many years, we knew too many South African children were not learning to read with meaning by the end of grade 3. But what we didn't know is the full picture of why, and what it is that we can do to really turbocharge the work that we're doing in foundation phase. So this is what makes the Funda Uphumelele National Survey so incredibly important. For the first time, we now have a national picture across 11 languages of how children develop the specific reading skills that lead to comprehension. The work behind this survey is both remarkable and quite rigorous. It has been led by a team of linguists, many of you who are here, and researchers from universities across the country, working hand in hand with officials from DBE. Together we've produced a technically sound and linguistically sensitive assessment in every one of our official languages. As I said, for the first time, we're not problematizing our languages, but we're realizing the real value of our languages in learning to read, and for children in learning to read. So this is no small achievement. It requires years of testing, refining, and validating the tools. It required listening to teachers and language experts. It required deep respect for the unique character of each of our languages. Funda Uphumelele has deliberately placed great emphasis on home language because children learn to read more effectively in the language that they understand, in the languages of their homes. When you learn to read and join letters, for instance, INDLU together to form a word indlu, it lights up certain images in your mind. And that's how the children are learning how to read. And so again, as I say, we are now realizing the true value of our home languages. Abantwana befunda ngolwimi lwabo bayakwazi into yoba bazikonekthele, bazicingele, bazivele le nto yenza ukuba kubekho isiseko sokufunda esiqinileyo. Yiyo loo nto ke sisithi sifowukhasa kakhulu kwi-foundations of learning. It's not just slogan hearing, but it's because we know it's a predictor of what will happen to children once they get on in much later in life. This is why the project matters so much, because it affirms that our languages matter by showing that we care if children learn specific reading skills in their home languages. We raise the status also of our languages. When children have a solid foundation in their home language, it also becomes a lot easier to become bilingual. And for which most children in South Africa, it means English as a first additional language. And sometimes there can be a fear that focusing simply on home language, it means that we are simply saying the value of English, which is the language of doing business in South Africa, is not there. But the research shows us that when children are able to read for meaning in their home language, they are much more able to pick up additional languages a lot quicker. So we're not just fixing a problem here and creating another one, we are fixing a problem and creating a far more conducive learning environment for our children. So therefore, the stronger their home language reading is, the more powerful the use of mother tongue as a pedagogical instrument is for later on. The results of Funda Uphumelele confirm that we still face serious challenges in the early grades. Too many of our children are not reaching the fluency benchmarks needed to be on track to read with comprehension by grade 4. But the good news now is that we understand much more precisely where the problem lies and therefore what to do about it. And so this is the value of good data, colleagues. It gives us the power to act intelligently and not blindly. And let me say this clearly, we are not measuring for the sake of measuring. The reading benchmarks that Funda Uphumelele work are designed to inform real change and real systemic change on 3 levels. The one level is a systemic level. We will use these results to monitor progress nationally, provincially, and in each language. At a district and a school support level, by distributing newly developed language-appropriate reading assessments to subject advisors in schools, this work will strengthen accountability and improve support from district officers and school management teams. And lastly, at a classroom level, teachers will use these benchmarks and accompanying tools to conduct diagnostic assessments with their learners to inform targeted remediation. And this is quite important that this work goes deep into the provinces, because it can't just be the work that is discussed about with us here, but it classroom. And as I said earlier, for the first time, we've got a study that doesn't say your home languages are a problem, but that says home languages are an asset, and we ought to use them. So I want to also take a moment to express my heartfelt appreciation to all of those who made this work possible. To the 25 linguists who represented all 11 South African languages, who brought their expertise, their care to developing and translating and refining assessments, siyabulele. To the teams from the University of Pretoria, Tshwane University of Technology, the University of Venda, Rhodes University, Nelson Mandela Institute, and the University of the Free State, the University of Mpumalanga, University of South Africa, Stellenbosch University, University of the Western Cape, Varsity College, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, your collaboration has been extraordinary. Also to our funding partners, the Xanax Foundation, FEM Foundation, UNICEF, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Old Mutual Foundation, Optima Foundation, the World Bank, Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, thank you for believing in this work and for investing in the foundational skills that will transform lives. And to the officials and the team here at DBE who led this coordinated and complex process, you have demonstrated what is possible when technical excellence meets public service commitment and where those two come together. So I appreciate the support that the branch heads, Mr. Pajachi, has involved in this project and the leadership from the DG for the work that has gone here. And now, colleagues, today's launch is not just about the release of this report. It's a call to refocus our attention to do what is needed to make sure that our children learn to read and read for meaning before they reach grade 4. The strategic reorientation that we spoke of at the beginning of the 7th administration was not a mistake. We said we needed to invert the pyramid so that we put value and stock on the foundations of learning as opposed to putting value and stock at the end of a child's career in school. And so the pyramid now is inverted. We've said that the foundations of learning are where we are going to be reorientating the basic education system in its entirety. And so if you tell me what your priorities are, then you must show me exactly where you work is. And so this is why this kind of work is important, because it's now validating that kind of strategic reorientation that we are talking about. We're not only saying that foundations of learning are important, but we're backing this up with evidence. We're backing this up by partnering with people who are prepared to put concrete evidence before us that says, yes, this is the right direction to move in. If we're going to change the South African education story, this is where we start. We start with the foundations of learning so that we can make sure that, that our children, by the time they get to grade 12, we no longer obsess about what the matric pass rate is going to be. I would rather be obsessed about how many children are ready for grade 1 when they leave grade R. I would rather be obsessed about that. And I would rather be obsessed about how many children by the time they get to grade 3 are able to read. Because then I don't have to obsess about whether or not children are taking maths and science in grade 10, 11, and 12. Because the foundations would have been there, and the foundations would have been strong. And so it's not to say that the higher end of our education system is not important, but it's to say in order for that to really perform optimally, this is where you have to begin. And so let's use this evidence from the survey, not just to talk about the problem, not just to lament about 8 out of 10 children can't read, but to talk about what have we learned. We've learned that languages are important, that home languages are an asset. What are we going to do about it? What are we going to inform the system about? So when we next conduct the next round of Funda Uphumelele, and I'm sure the team is probably thinking, we just finished this a whole lot of work. But when we conduct the next round, I'm confident that we will see progress, not only in the numbers, but in the daily experience of children who can now open a book and make sense of the world around them. Nothing absolutely breaks my heart when we read about statistics of children who are simply non-readers. That's a crisis. And as I said, I'm definitely not one of the generation of leaders that wants to stand here and lament about the crisis. Let us be part of the solution, and it all starts here. Thank you for all your contributions and the contributions that you're going to make, because I think it's important that we get those inputs and we use them going forward. And I want to leave you with the words of a French author, Victor Hugo, who once said, "To learn to read is to light a fire. Every syllable that is spelled out is a spark." And so let us fix the reading culture in our country. Thank you very much.
Another round of applause. Thank you very much, Minister. And I think everyone in this room must be as excited as I am to hear about the importance of inverting the pyramid. And I really don't want to be a child in this day and age, and particularly a matric child. So if we really focus on the early years, on the foundations, as the Minister is imploring us, I think really we're going to start to see how the narrative about our children is going to be rewritten. So with those words from the Minister and that national call to action, and the national call to action is, if it is a national call, it says to everyone in the room and those who are not in this room, to really start to refocus on the foundations for learning, to make sure that we lay that solid base so that our children can be able to have a new story told about them. Thank you for reminding us that our languages are assets, and I think the most important thing is how should we then preserve those assets. And how do we do that? And how can we celebrate our children and celebrate their languages? It's really the way in which we can do it is to make sure that we give them the tools and we really give them the fighting chance. And that takes us now to the tea that I never served you earlier on, tea or coffee. And I hope that we do have that tea and we do have that coffee. We are going to have discussions so that as this room, we start talking about what the minister has called on us and what we've heard from all our speakers since we came in this morning. When we come back from tea, you now have about 22 minutes to sprint to tea and sprint to the bathrooms and be back so that we can start sharply at 12. Thank you very much, Minister. May we rise and allow the minister to then leave the room. Thank you.
Betul.